The auctioneer had a voice like a man reading names off a war memorial, and Rowena Aldous stood at the back of the sale room and listened to him sell off the last pieces of her uncle's life for less than they were worth. Lot 41, a saddle cracked at the horn. Lot 42, a box of horse brasses, green with age. Lot 43, a wind-up gramophone that no longer wound. The room smelled of dust and other people's damp coats, and the few buyers who'd bothered to come on a wet Tuesday in the dead middle of nowhere bid in the flat, embarrassed murmurs of people picking a carcass. Nobody was looking at Rowena. That suited her. She had spent a great deal of her life being not looked at, and had learned over the years that invisibility was a kind of armor you could wear anywhere, and no one could take off you. And that concludes the movable property of the late Mr. Silas Aldous, the auctioneer said, gathering his papers. The land itself, as you'll all be aware, passes by the terms of the will and is not part of today's sale. A ripple went through the room. Not laughter, quite. Something worse, the small, knowing exhale of people who all shared a joke at someone else's expense. "The Aldous Ranch," said a man near the front, loud enough to carry. "God help whoever's got that round their neck." "Has it got a new owner, then?" "Some niece I heard from away." "Poor cow." Rowena did not react. She had come to understand her late uncle's land the way the whole district understood it, as a thing to be pitied and avoided. And she had come to the sale room not to defend it, but to listen, because you could learn more about a place from how people talked about it when they thought no one from it was in the room than you could from 100 surveys. And they talked about the Aldous Ranch the way people talk about a house where something bad once happened. 1,100 acres of scrubland and thin pasture out on the eastern edge of the moor, where the soil went sour and the water tasted of iron, and nothing planted there had thrived in living memory. Silas Aldous had run cattle on it for 40 years and buried most of them, one bad winter at a time, and had died alone in the low stone farmhouse with the wind coming through the gaps he'd never had the money to mend. The land was worthless. Everyone knew the land was worthless. The bank had said so, in a valuation Rowena had in her coat pocket. The neighboring farmers said so, when they said anything at all. The estate agent had said so, gently, the way you tell someone their dog isn't coming back. "You'll not sell it, love," he'd told her. "Not that. Nobody's bought or sold a foot of the Aldous land in 30 years. It's not that the price is low. It's that there's no price. There's no market for cursed ground." Cursed. He'd actually used the word, and then looked embarrassed at himself, and Rowena had watched him be embarrassed and said nothing, because she had learned long ago that the most useful thing you can do with a person's superstition is let it stand. She signed the papers the solicitor slid across to her in the corridor afterward. The transfer of 1,100 worthless acres into the name of a woman everyone in the room had already dismissed as a poor relation come to collect a bad joke, and she drove out to see what she had inherited. The farmhouse was worse than the photographs, which is the usual way of things. It sat in a fold of the land with its back to the prevailing wind, low and gray and stubborn, roofed in slate gone the color of the sky so that from a distance the house seemed to have no top at all, as though it had sunk into the moor up to its eaves. The yard was a churn of mud and rusted machinery, a dead tractor, a collapsed byre, a water trough green to the brim. Beyond it all, the land ran away in long-done waves to a horizon smudged with rain, and there was not a tree on it taller than a man, and not a sound but the wind and, somewhere, the complaint of a single unhappy crow. Rowena stood in the yard in the rain and looked at all of it, and felt, to her own quiet surprise, something that was almost the opposite of despair. She felt interested, because Rowena Aldous had not come to this ranch as the poor niece from away that the sale room took her for. She had let them think it, the way she let everyone think whatever cost her least. But she had spent a long time, a career in fact, though it was not a career she advertised, learning to read exactly the kind of land everyone else had written off. And standing in that sour, shunned, worthless yard, with the iron taste of the water in the air and the dead grass lying flat under the rain, some old professional instinct had woken in her and begun, very quietly, to pay attention. She was not going to say why. Not yet. A person who shows their cards in the first hand deserves the game they get. But she walked the near fields that afternoon in her unsuitable town coat, in the rain, for 3 hours, and she crouched now and again to take up a handful of the soil and smell it and rub it between her fingers. And once she stopped for a long time at a low place in the ground where the grass grew in a strange dark ring, and the earth beneath it was slick and faintly, unmistakably iridescent, a shimmer on a puddle that a farmer would call dirty water, and that Rowena Aldous, who was not a farmer, called something else entirely, under her breath to no one. Then she stood up and looked out across 1,100 acres of land that an entire district had agreed to despise, and she said, quietly, into the wind, "Well, aren't you interesting?" She did not know, that first afternoon, the whole of what was under the Aldous land. That would take her months and instruments and a good deal of patience, and it is not yet time in this story to say it plainly. But she knew enough to know that the district had made a mistake, a long, comfortable, generational mistake, and that mistakes like that one were, in Rowena's considerable experience, the most valuable things in the world, because a truth that everyone has agreed to ignore is a truth with no competition. What she did not yet know was that she was not the only person who had begun to suspect it. Because the strange thing about the Aldous ranch, the thing that did not fit the story of worthless cursed ground, was that in the last 2 years, someone had been buying up every scrap of land around it. Quietly, through shell companies with clean, dull names, the failing farm to the north sold for cash to a land management consultancy. The Bulai's smallholding to the east, bought when old Bulai's debts came due, by a firm no one had ever heard of. A ribbon of moorland to the south, purchased from the council for grazing rights that no one ever exercised. Rowena would find all of this later, thread by thread, the way she found everything. But even on that first wet afternoon, standing in the yard, she noticed the one thing that did not belong. A car, parked on the ridge road half a mile off on the far side of the eastern boundary. A dark, expensive, out-of-place car, sitting still in the rain where no one had any reason to sit. And though she could not see the driver, she had the distinct and certain sense, the sense she had learned never to ignore, that whoever was in that car was not admiring the view. They were watching the house. They were watching her. Rowena Aldous looked at the car for a long, unhurried moment, letting whoever was inside it see that she had seen them. Then she turned, without hurry, and walked back to the farmhouse through the rain, and let herself in through the warped back door, and put the kettle on the range as though she had lived there all her life. She had inherited an empty ranch that everyone avoided. And someone with a great deal of money had gone to a great deal of trouble to make sure that, when the last Aldous finally died, the worthless land all around it belonged to them. They had made only one mistake. They had assumed the niece from away would be no trouble at all. The car was gone in the morning. Rowena had not expected it to stay. Watchers, in her experience, were rarely bold. Boldness cost money and left traces, and the people who watch quietly from ridge roads are usually being paid by people who prefer neither. But the car had told her something simply by having been there, and she spent the first gray hour of the day at the kitchen table with a mug of iron-tasting tea, writing in the small hardback notebook she carried everywhere, setting down what she knew in the plain, flat lines she always used, because a thing written plainly could not lie to you the way a thing merely thought could. Land shunned as worthless, everyone agrees. No market, no buyers, 30 years. Yet, someone watching the house the day the new owner arrives. A watcher means the land is not worthless. A watcher means the land is worth watching. Who profits from 1,100 acres no one wants. Only someone who knows it is worth something, and needs everyone else to keep believing it is not. She underlined the last line and looked at it for a while and drank her terrible tea. Then she went to find out who owned the land around her. It took her 4 days, and she did most of it from the farmhouse kitchen, on a laptop tethered to a phone signal she had to stand on a chair by the north window to catch. But Rowena Aldous was very good at the particular kind of patient reading that turns public records into a picture, and by the end of the 4 days she had the picture, and it was uglier and cleverer than she'd guessed. Every parcel of land bordering the Aldous ranch, every single one north, east, south, and the awkward wedge to the west that took in the old Drover's Road, had changed hands in the last 26 months, not to farmers, not to developers, whose names and intentions would have been public and loud. They had gone, one after another, to a scatter of small companies with bland interchangeable names. Cheviot Land Holdings, Marchmont Rural Assets, Greyweather Consultancy Limited. Different names, different registered addresses, different nominee directors who were plainly just names for hire. But Rowena had untangled ownership chains far more sophisticated than this for a living, and she pulled the thread patiently, company by company, filing by filing, through the little forest of nominees and holding structures, until every thread ran back, as she had known it would, to a single hand. The hand belonged to a company called Marrowdale Energy. She sat back from the laptop when she found it, and looked out at the wet dun land, and felt the cold, clean click of a thing coming into focus. Marrowdale Energy was not small, and it was not obscure, and it was very much in the business of what lay under the ground. It was a mid-sized outfit, aggressive, privately held, the kind of company that made its money not by the slow grind of the majors, but by getting to overlooked ground first and cheap, by finding value where the big players hadn't bothered to look, or had looked and left, and buying it up quietly before anyone understood what was there. And it was run, Rowena found with another few minutes reading, by a man named Julian Hartley Vane, chief executive, majority shareholder, and according to a glossy trade press profile she pulled up, a man much given to being photographed in an open-necked shirt in front of things he owned, talking about unlocking stranded value and seeing what others miss. He had spent 2 years and, Rowena estimated, several £1,000,000 quietly buying a ring of worthless moorland around a farm he did not own. You do not do that, she thought, for grazing. You do that when you are certain, that something valuable runs under the whole district, and you intend to own the ground on every side of it, so that when the one parcel you don't own finally comes free, the owner has no leverage, no neighbors to bargain with, no way to move a drop of anything off their land except across yours, and no choice at last but to sell to you, cheap, the final worthless-looking piece that is in fact the keystone of the entire deposit. He had been waiting, she understood, for Silas Aldous to die. And now Silas Aldous had died, and the keystone had passed not to some biddable stranger who'd take the first check offered, but to Rowena, and Julian Hartley Vane had sent a car to sit on the ridge and see what manner of problem the niece from away was going to be. Rowena closed the laptop. Grazing, she said aloud to the empty kitchen, and almost smiled. She needed to be sure about what was under the land before she did anything else, because a suspicion is not a position, and a position is not a proof, and Rowena had built an entire life on never confusing the three. So over the following fortnight she did the thing she was, in fact, better trained to do than perhaps anyone Julian Hartley Vane had ever underestimated. And here, at last, this story will tell you plainly what it has been holding back, because Rowena is about to act on it, and the reader deserves to understand what they are watching. Rowena Aldous was a petroleum geologist. Not a hobbyist, not a dabbler, a subsurface specialist who had spent 20 years reading the hidden architecture of the ground for exploration companies on 4 continents, and who had latterly, after a falling out she did not discuss, left the industry that had shaped her and gone quiet. She had been, in her time, one of the people the majors flew in when a prospect was ambiguous and the drilling was expensive and someone needed to say, with their name on it, "Yes, it's there," or "No, it isn't." She could read a seismic section the way a doctor reads an X-ray. She could stand in a sour, shunned field and smell iron in the water and see iridescence on a puddle and know that these were not a curse but a signature. The surface tells of something that had been quietly seeping up through the fractured rock beneath the Aldous land for longer than anyone in the district had been alive. The whole reason the land was cursed, she now understood, was the reason it was priceless. The water tasted of iron and hydrocarbons because there were hydrocarbons under it. The pasture grew thin and strange over certain low places because gas leaked slow through the soil there, and had done for a century. Generations of Aldouses had failed to farm this land not through bad luck, but because the land had never wanted to be a farm. It had been trying, in its mute geological way, to tell them what it was, and they had heard only a curse. Silas Aldous had died believing his life's work worthless. Rowena intended that he would be the last Aldous to believe it. She could not run a seismic survey alone, and would not have wanted to yet. Nothing announced, "I know what's here," louder than a survey crew. But she did not need one. She had her own eyes and her own training, and over that fortnight she walked every acre of the 1100, mapping by hand what the surface told her. The seeps, the gas-thin pasture, the iridescent low ground, the way a dry stream cut had exposed, in one bank, a tilt of dark shale that told her more about the structure beneath than a month of another man's paperwork. She took samples in clean jars. She sent 3 of them, under a name that was not quite hers, to a laboratory 200 miles away that did not know or care whose land they came from. And she waited for the numbers, because the numbers would turn her certainty into the one thing Julian Hartley Vane could not argue with, dismiss, or buy. The numbers came back on a Thursday. She read them standing on the chair by the north window, in the only corner of the house with signal, and she stood there for a long time after she'd finished reading, very still, looking out at 1100 acres of land that an entire district had agreed to despise, and that she now held in the numbers in her hand. It was not a modest deposit. It was not the awkward, marginal, barely worth it prospect that a man like Hartley Vane might justify 2 years and a few £1,000,000 of quiet land buying to secure. It was, unless every figure in her hand was wrong, a great deal more than that. It was the kind of number that Rowena had seen perhaps 3 times in a long career, the kind that changed the men who found it, usually for the worse. And it lay, all of it, in a structure whose keystone, whose single essential access, whose central and controlling parcel, was the sour, shunned, worthless-looking farm that Julian Hartley Vane had been so patiently, so cleverly, so nearly successfully arranging to buy for almost nothing from a poor niece who wouldn't know what she was standing on. Rowena stepped down off the chair. She made herself a mug of the iron-tasting tea, and she drank it slowly at the kitchen table while the light went out of the moor, and she thought, not with triumph, because triumph was a feeling for people who hadn't yet done the hard part, but with a deep and level and gathering purpose, about a man in an open-necked shirt who had spent 2 years being certain that the last Aldous would be no trouble at all. "Mr. Hartley Vane," she said quietly to the darkening window, "I think you and I are going to have a great deal to talk about." And half a mile away, on the ridge road, headlights came on in the dusk where a dark car had been sitting, unlit, for rather longer than Rowena had been meant to notice. The offer came, as Rowena had known it would, wrapped in charm. It arrived first as a knock at the warped back door on a bright cold morning, the first bright morning since she'd come, the moor for once gold instead of gray, and when she opened it, there was a woman on the step she had not expected. Not Hartley Vane, a woman of perhaps 50, weathered and square and dressed for the land rather than for a meeting, with a collie sitting at her heel and an expression that managed to be wary and kind at the same time. "You'll be the niece," the woman said. "Rowena, I'm Frances Bulai. I farmed the land east of here before I didn't." A grimace. "You'll have found my name on some of that paperwork by now if you're the sort that reads it, and something tells me you're the sort that reads it." Rowena looked at her for a moment, recalibrating. Bulai, the small holding to the east bought when the debts came due by a firm no one had heard of. One of the ring, one of the swallowed farms. "You'd best come in, Mrs. Bulai," she said. "The tea tastes of iron, but it's hot." Frances Bulai came in, and the collie came in, and over the iron tea a picture assembled itself that Rowena had half guessed and was grimmer for hearing whole. The Bulais had farmed their land 4 generations. 2 bad years and a sick husband had put them behind on the bank, and just at the moment the ground was soft under them, an offer had come, generous, almost embarrassingly generous, from a pleasant man in an open-necked shirt who spoke of land consolidation, and taking the worry off their hands, and had paid, for tired Eastmoor grazing, nearly twice what it could ever be worth. "And I were grateful," Frances said, and the word was bitter in her mouth. "That's the part sticks in my throat. I stood in my own kitchen and thanked the man. It were only after, when I saw he'd bought the Ackerley place too, and old Todd's and the council ground, that I started to wonder why a man pays over the odds for bad land again and again, all round the one farm he doesn't buy." She looked hard at Rowena. "Your uncle's. He'd have had this one too, would Hartley Vane, and cheap, only Sela's would never sell him a blade of grass. Hated him, wouldn't say why, just not to that one. Near the last thing the old man said to me over this fence." Her jaw tightened. "And now Sela's is gone, and here you are, and there's a car been sitting on my old Ridge Road 3 nights this week. So I'll ask you plain, because I've earned plain. Do you know what's under this ground, Rowena Aldous? Because I think you do. I think it's why you've walked every field in the rain like you were looking for something. And I think that man knows too, and I think he's been counting on nobody else ever finding out." Rowena looked at Frances Bulai across the iron tea for a long moment, at the weathered, wary, unfoolish face of a woman who had been cheated, and had worked out that she'd been cheated, and had come, at some cost to her pride, to the one door in the district where the truth might be. And Rowena made a decision she did not make lightly, because she made almost no decisions lightly. She decided to trust her. "Sit down properly, Mrs. Bulai," she said, "and I'll tell you exactly what's under this ground, and then I'm going to tell you what I think that man did to every farm on this moor, including yours. And then, if you've the stomach for it, I'm going to ask for your help putting it right." Hartley Vane himself came 3 days later. He came the way powerful men come when they have decided that charm will settle a thing, unannounced, mid-morning, in the dark, expensive car itself, so that Rowena understood at once that the watcher on the ridge and the man in the open-necked shirt were, when it suited him, the same convenience. He unfolded from the car into the muddy yard in boots that had never seen mud, and he looked at the sinking gray farmhouse and the dead tractor and the green trough with the frank, faint distaste of a man pricing a thing he intends to improve. And then he turned his smile on Rowena where she stood in the doorway, and the smile was very good. She would give him that. It was a very good smile. "Miss Aldous," he said warmly, as though they were old friends meeting after too long. "Julian Hartley Vane, forgive me descending on you unannounced. I find these things go better face to face than through the dreadful machinery of solicitors, don't you? May I?" And he was across the yard and half into her kitchen before the "may I" had finished, which told her a great deal about how he expected the next hour to go. She gave him iron tea. He drank none of it. He was good, through the first 10 minutes, genuinely good, and Rowena, who had spent a career among clever men, could appreciate the craft of it the way one professional appreciates another. He was sympathetic about her uncle. He was rueful about the state of the land, these old moor farms. They break the hearts of everyone who loves them, and they never, ever pay. He spoke gently of his hope to do something with the tired ground of the district, to bring a bit of investment to a corner the world had forgotten, to consolidate the failing farms into something that might at last give the moor a future. He was, to hear him tell it, very nearly a philanthropist. And then, so smoothly that a less careful listener would have missed the join, he arrived at the offer. He would take the Aldous ranch off her hands, all 1,100 acres, the house, the lot. And because he was not a small man, and because he understood what it meant to inherit a burden like this from someone you'd loved, he would pay, and here he named a figure. And it was, for 1,100 acres of cursed moorland that no one else on earth would give a penny for, a genuinely, startlingly generous number. It was also, Rowena knew to the decimal, roughly 1/400th of what the ground beneath her feet was worth. She let a silence open after the number. She had learned the value of that silence long ago, and she watched Julian Hartley Vane sit in it, comfortable, certain, a man who had made this offer to 4 farms already and watched 4 grateful families thank him for it in their own kitchens, waiting for the poor niece from away to do the same. "That's a very generous offer," Rowena said at last, mildly. "It's more than generous," he agreed, warm and easy. "It's frankly sentimental of me, but I've a soft spot for these old places and—" "For land with oil under it," said Rowena. "One usually does." She said it quite gently, and she watched it land. For just a moment, half a second, no more, the smile did not change, but something behind it did. Some swift, cold recalculation moving in the eyes while the mouth held its shape. And Rowena, who had been watching for exactly that flicker, saw it and knew everything she needed to know about the rest of this conversation and the war that was going to follow it. Then the smile widened and became, if anything, warmer, and Julian Hartley Vane leaned back in his chair in her uncle's cold kitchen and looked at Rowena Aldous with what was, for the first time, something like real attention. The attention a man gives a thing he has just discovered is not what he assumed, and might therefore have to be dealt with rather than simply bought. "Well," he said softly, "you're not quite the niece I was expecting, are you?" "No," said Rowena, "people generally aren't." The charm lasted exactly as long as it was useful, which is the way of charm in men like Julian Hartley Vane. He finished his visit pleasantly enough. He was too clever to threaten a woman who had just told him she knew what was under her land, because a threat, at that stage, would have been information, but he left, and within a week the pleasantness was gone from the district as though it had never been, and Rowena began to learn what it meant to be the last obstacle between a determined man and a fortune. It began with access. The Aldous ranch, she had always understood, sat at the center of the ring. What she had not fully reckoned, because she had spent her career reading rock and not property law, was how completely that ring could close. Every road onto her land, every track, every historic right-of-way, crossed ground that Julian Hartley Vane now owned. And one gray morning she drove out to the county town for supplies and came back to find the drover's road gated and padlocked where it crossed the old Ackerley ground, a smart new sign bolted to the smart new gate, private, no access, MARCHMOUNT rural ASSETS. A second gate had gone up on the northern track. By the end of the week there were 4, and Rowena Aldous, owner of 1,100 acres, could reach her own front door by exactly one remaining lane, a rutted, half-drowned track across the western wedge that Hartley Vane, she had no doubt, had left open precisely so that he could close it last, when the closing would hurt most. It was not quite illegal. That was the cleverness of it. He owned the land the roads crossed. A man may gate his own land. There were rights of way, ancient and probably enforceable, but probably and enforceable are words that mean years and money, and Hartley Vane had both and was betting she had neither. He was not trying to steal her land anymore. He had moved to the next thing, making the land impossible to hold. A farm you cannot reach, cannot supply, cannot move a beast or a barrel or a survey crew across, is a farm that strangles slowly, And a woman strangling slowly, he plainly believed, would in the end be grateful for the same generous check he'd offered in the sunshine, and would sign it, and thank him, the way Frances Billy had thanked him in her kitchen. He had misjudged two things. The first was Rowena, which was the mistake he had been making since the Ridge Road, and would go on making until it ruined him. The second was Frances Billy. "He can gate the Ackerley Road," Frances said, spreading an ordnance map across Rowena's kitchen table with the flat of her weathered hand, "and he can gate the North Track, and he can sit there feeling clever. But I've farmed this moor 40 year, and there's things a man learns in 40 year that don't show on his shiny title deeds." Her blunt finger moved across the map. "There's a bridleway here, old, unregistered proper, but it's on the tithe map from 1841, and it's been walked in living memory, which is all the law wants. And here," the finger moved again, "the Beck Crossing, common land that, never enclosed. He doesn't own it, and he can't, and it takes you off your western wedge and onto the public road at Skelder without setting a foot on a yard of his ground." She looked up, and there was something fierce and glad in her weathered face. "He's a clever man from away, Rowena. He bought the roads. He never thought to ask an old woman which paths were older than the roads." Rowena looked at the map, and at Frances, and felt the particular warmth she had learned not to distrust, the warmth of finding an ally who brought exactly the thing you lacked. "Frances," she said, "how many of the others would talk to me? The Swallowed Farms, the Ackerleys, old Todd, the ones he bought and gated and forgot." Frances Billy's mouth set. "All of them," she said, "every last one. He paid us over the odds and made us feel like fools for taking it, and then he treated us like we'd never existed. There's not a family on this moor he bought that doesn't lie awake wondering what they sold. You show them what's really under this ground, girl, you show them the number, and you'll not have to ask twice." She paused. "But you'll want more than angry farmers if you're to take on a man like that. Angry farmers he's beaten before. What have you got that he can't buy?" And Rowena, who had been turning exactly that question in her mind for a fortnight, told her. Here is what Rowena had. She had the surface survey she had walked out herself, field by field in the rain, but that, she knew, a paid expert of Hartley veins could dispute. She had the laboratory numbers on the samples, but samples, he would say, could be salted, mislabeled, faked, and a private lab 200 miles away was not a witness a court would love. She had her own name and her own 20 years and her own trained eye, but he would come with 3 experts to her one, and would make sure the county understood that the poor niece from away was a fantasist who talked herself into buried treasure to avoid facing that she'd inherited a ruin. None of that on its own was enough. Rowena knew it. A truth is not a weapon until it is a truth that cannot be argued away, and she had spent her whole career learning the difference. So she went looking for the thing that could not be argued away, and she found it where she had begun, in the one part of this story that had never quite fit, in the question of why Silas hated him. Because that was the loose thread. Frances had said it over the fence in the first week. Silas would never sell him a blade of grass, hated him, wouldn't say why. And a man who has decided the world's forgotten his land does not, as a rule, have strong feelings about a smart energy executive from away, unless the executive was not, in fact, a stranger, unless there was history. Rowena went into her uncle's papers. Silas Aldous had kept everything, in the way of a solitary man with a stone house and long winters, decades of it, boxed and stacked in the cold back room, receipts and letters and the sediment of a life. She spent 3 days in that room with a lamp and a pair of gloves against the cold, working through it with the same patience she brought to everything, and on the 3rd day, in a biscuit tin at the bottom of a box of nothing, she found the letters. They were 9 years old. They were from Marrowdale Energy, and they were signed by Julian Hartley Vane, and they were addressed to Silas Aldous, and they told Rowena, in cold black type, that Hartley Vane had not been waiting patiently for the old man to die at all. 9 years ago, Hartley Vane had known. He had approached Silas, young company then, hungry, with an offer for mineral rights on the Aldous land. And Silas, who was not the ignorant, curse-fearing farmer the district took him for, who had lived on that iron-tasting land his whole life and understood in his bones that it was strange, had been suspicious enough to have his own quiet test done. There was a soil report in the tin, 9 years old, crude but clear, and had grasped that the smiling young man wanted to pay him a pittance for something that might be worth a very great deal, and Silas had refused. And Hartley Vane, in the last of the letters, had written something that a more careful man would never have put on paper, a line, cold beneath its courtesy, about how the value of stranded assets tends to decline over time, and lone holdouts tend to find the market moves against them. It was a threat, 9 years old in his own signature, and it was the seed of everything, the ring of purchases, the strangling gates, the patient waiting not for an old man to die in ignorance, but for an old man who knew and had defied him, and whom Hartley Vane had then set out, methodically, over 9 years, to isolate and outlast and beat. Rowena sat in the cold back room with the letters in her gloved hands, and understood at last the whole shape of the man she was fighting, and the whole shape of what her uncle had endured, alone, in this sinking gray house, for 9 years, guarding a secret and a principle that had cost him every comfort and every friend, and had made the district think him a mad old failure clinging to cursed ground. Silas Aldous had not been a fool who died believing his land worthless. He had been the only man on the moor who knew exactly what it was worth, and had refused, to his last breath, to let Julian Hartley Vane steal it. Rowena's eyes stung once in the lamplight. She let them. Then she gathered the letters and the 9-year-old soil report and the biscuit tin, and she carried them through to the kitchen and laid them on the table beside Francis Boulai's tithe map, and she said, in a voice that had gone very quiet and very level, "He's put it in writing, Francis. 9 years ago, he told my uncle to his face what he'd do, and then he spent 9 years doing it." She set her hand flat on the letters. "This is the thing he can't buy. This is the thing that can't be argued away. He didn't just try to cheat me. He's been cheating this whole moor for a decade, and now I can prove he knew exactly what he was doing the entire time." Francis looked at the letters and at Rowena, and something settled in the old farmer's face. The look of a woman who has been waiting a long time for the ground to finally tilt back the other way. "Then we don't strangle quiet," Francis said. "We don't fight him farm by farm in the dark the way he likes it. We do it where the whole county's watching, and we do it all at once, and we make it so loud he can't make it small." "Yes," said Rowena, "that's exactly what we do," chose the planning meeting. It was Francis who saw it first, the way she'd seen the old paths, the one arena in the whole district that Julian Hartley Vane could neither cancel nor control, because it was already his, already scheduled, already the thing he'd been building toward. Marrowdale Energy had lodged an application with the county council, outlined permission for land management and resource development across the consolidated moorland holdings, the ring, all of it, the swallowed farm stitched into one great parcel on the planner's maps. It was the move before the last move. Get the permission in place across the ground he owned, and the Aldous ranch at the center would be a hole in a donut, worthless to anyone but him, surrounded on every side by a permitted development it could not join and could not escape. The final squeeze, dressed as a zoning matter, to be waved through on a wet Wednesday evening while the county dozed. The application would be heard in public. It had to be, and any resident of the district had the right to attend and to speak. "He's built his own courtroom," Rowena said, looking at the notice, "and he's forgotten to lock the door." They prepared for 3 weeks. Rowena did the thing she was best at, which was to make the truth so complete and so ordered that it could not be waved away. She had the 9-year-old letters, and she had them authenticated. Hartley Vane's signature verified against public filings, the dates confirmed, the whole provenance made unarguable. She had Silas's own soil report from the tin, and she paired it with her own survey and the laboratory numbers. And then, because she knew a single private lab could be smeared, she did the expensive, patient, unanswerable thing. She commissioned a second and a third independent analysis from laboratories of unimpeachable reputation, sending samples openly this time, under her own name, with a solicitor witnessing the collection so that not one grain could be called salted. The numbers came back the same. Then the same again. The deposit was real. It was large. And now it was documented by parties with nothing to gain and reputations to lose. And Frances did the thing she was best at, which was people. One by one she brought them in, the Ackerleys, old Todd, the council ground tenants, every family Hartley Vane had bought cheap and made grateful and then forgotten. Rowena sat at her kitchen table across many long evenings and showed each of them, plainly, without triumph, exactly what had been under the moor the whole time, and exactly what it was worth, and exactly how a smiling man in an open-necked shirt had used their bad years to take it for a fraction of nothing. She did not have to stoke their anger. She only had to show them the truth and let it do to them what it had done to her. By the night of the planning meeting, Rowena Aldous did not walk in alone as the niece from away. She walked in with the whole moor behind her. The council chamber was a low municipal room with strip lighting and stacking chairs, and it was fuller than it had been in years. Word had got round. Word always gets round on a moor. And the public seats were packed with farmers and their families, weathered faces set hard, and a scatter of local press who'd come expecting a dull zoning matter and had begun, from the look of the room, to suspect they'd got something else. Julian Hartley Vane sat at the front with two solicitors and a consultant, in a good suit this time, no open collar, and he was relaxed and expansive and entirely in command, a man attending the coronation of a plan 9 years in the making. He had noticed the crowd. He was too clever not to. But he had misread it, as men who buy their way through the world always misread a room they think they've already bought. He took the packed seats for spectacle, for the small excitement of a quiet district, and not for what it was. He made his case first, and he made it well. Investment, jobs, a future for a forgotten moor, responsible development of stranded rural land. The consultant showed maps. The ring glowed on the projector, whole and rational, and the little uncolored hole of the Aldous ranch at its center was mentioned only in passing, as an unfortunate gap the applicant hoped in time to bring into the scheme. It was smooth and it was reasonable and it was, very nearly, Rowena thought, watching from the public seats, enough. Then the chair asked whether any member of the public wished to speak. And Rowena Aldous stood up. She was not dressed for it. She had come as she always came, plainly, a woman easy to overlook, and she saw Hartley Vane glance back at her and place her and dismiss her all in the same half-second. The niece, the holdout, the small nuisance. And she saw him settle back, unworried, because what could she do here in his own courtroom but complain? She did not complain. She spoke quietly, and the room went quiet to hear her, and she laid it out the way she laid everything out, plainly in order so that it could not lie. She told them what was under the moor. Not as a claim, as a documented fact, 3 independent laboratories, a solicitor's witness chain, numbers she read out clearly into the quiet room so that every farmer in it understood, at last and exactly, what had been beneath their fields the whole time they were being told it was cursed. She watched the understanding move across their faces. She watched the press stop being bored. Then she told them what it was worth, and she watched the number land on a room full of people who had sold their land for a fraction of it, and felt the temperature of the room begin to change. And then, while Hartley Vane's solicitors were leaning in to whisper, and his smooth, expansive certainty was curdling at the edges, Rowena said, in the same quiet voice, "The applicant would have you believe he only recently saw the potential of this land, that he's a man of vision, bringing investment to ground the world forgot." She let a beat fall. "He has known exactly what is under this moor for 9 years. I can prove it. because 9 years ago he wrote to my uncle, Silas Aldous, and offered him a pittance for it, and when my uncle refused, he wrote this." And she read the line aloud, the cold line beneath the courtesy. "The value of stranded assets tends to decline over time, and lone holdouts tend to find the market moves against them." His signature, 9 years old. Read out clear into a silent municipal room, while local press wrote it down. "That is not a warning about the market," Rowena said. "That is a plan, and here is the plan carried out." And she laid it before them, step by step, the ring of purchases, farm by farm, each one bought in a bad year for over the odds by a man who knew what lay beneath and made sure the sellers never did. The gates thrown up the week she inherited, the strangling of the one farm he could not buy. She turned once to the packed public seats, to the Ackerleys and old Todd and Francis Bolai and all the swallowed farms, and she said simply, "He didn't pay you generously. He paid you a rounding error, and let you thank him for it, so that none of you would ever look under your own fields." The room came apart then, not into chaos, but into something worse for Hartley Vane, a low, gathering, unanimous anger, the sound of a great many people understanding all at once exactly what had been done to them. His solicitor was on his feet. The chair was calling for order. And Julian Hartley Vane, for the first time since a car had sat on a ridge road in the rain, had lost the shape of his own face, the smooth certainty gone, replaced by the specific, dawning horror of a man who has just watched the poor niece from away take the courtroom he built and turn it, in the space of 10 quiet minutes, into the instrument of his ruin. The reversal did not need Rowena to force it. She had built it so that it fell of its own weight. The application collapsed that night. No counsel would grant it now, under that much scrutiny, with the press already filing. But that was the least of it. The 9-year-old letter, once read into a public record, could not be unread. Rowena had already placed copies, with the authentication, in the hands of a solicitor and a journalist and a regulator before she ever stood up, because she never confused a truth spoken with a truth secured. In the weeks that followed, the pattern she'd laid out, the systematic purchase of land at knowing undervalue, from vulnerable sellers kept deliberately ignorant of a mineral deposit the buyer had privately confirmed, became precisely the sort of thing that regulators and courts exist to unwind. The swallowed farmers together, with Rowena's documentation and Francis's fierce organizing, and the letters as their spine, brought the case that no single strangled farm could ever have brought alone. Marrowdale's investors, who had tolerated aggression, did not tolerate exposure. The thing that destroyed Julian Hartley Vane in the end was not Rowena's cleverness, but his own signature, his own greed put in writing 9 years too early, his own certainty that no one who mattered would ever be looking. He had built his fortune on the belief that value hidden from its owners belonged to whoever found it first. He had simply never imagined that the last owner would be someone who could read the ground better than he could.